name is Victor Lethbridge. My traditional name is Tatanka Workshops, and I'm a member of the Wood Mountain Lakota First Nation in southern Saskatchewan.
All across the country, Canadians were appalled to wake up in mid-June to news that bodies had been found in unmarked graves at the site of a former residential school at Kamloops, BC.
What the residential school experience did to many people was it robbed future generations of their culture, their language, their ability to live life as had been lived for thousands of years.
Many Canadians were not even aware of the residential school system going back as far as the winter of 1920. That's when the federal government mandated compulsory school attendance for Native children between the ages of 7 and 15. If parents resisted, they were incarcerated.
As Indigenous people, we cared for the land, and we used knowledge gathered over hundreds of years to work with nature, to preserve it for future generations, to ensure that there was a food source, and to ensure that we didn't waste the resources around us, because everything was a precious commodity.
Historically, the buffalo was a vital source of food, shelter, and clothing for the First Nations people. In the late 1800s, the mass slaughter of buffalo almost caused their extinction. Fewer buffalo meant a critical shortage of food, and that in turn forced tribes in southern Canada to accept treaties and become dependent on government. This caused a ripple effect that was felt all the way to Canada's northern territories.
My grandfather, William Lethbridge, the language and all of his knowledge stopped with him. When we'd ask him about it, he would talk a little bit, and he'd say, "No, that's enough." He stopped, because his experience with the residential school is like, that's no good and that's not the way to be. And for him, he was torn. He was caught between two worlds. The world that he knew as a youngster, and then the world that was being put upon him during the residential school experience.
Sir John A. Macdonald, Canada's first Prime Minister, created the Department of Indian and Northern Affairs in 1889. Today, the department is called Indigenous Services Canada. The purpose of the department was to give the federal government legislative authority over the Indians and the lands reserved for them. In 1892, the Government of Canada passed an order regulating the operation of Indian residential schools. It set up partnerships with churches to provide education. In 1907, Dr. Peter Bryce, Chief Medical Officer for Indian Affairs, wrote a report describing the poor standards of care as the primary cause of death of children in the Canadian residential school system. He was ignored and soon forced to retire. After the First World War, Duncan Campbell Scott, a superintendent of Indian Affairs, expressed this opinion to a parliamentary committee. Our objective is to continue until there is not a single Indian in Canada that has not been absorbed into the body politic. From the extermination of the buffalo to forced attendance at residential schools, Canadian Indigenous history has been forever changed by these events.
When interviews of residential school survivors took place, there was lots of mention about being lonely, being separated from family, being separated from where they knew home to be. And even when they were within the schools, if they had brothers or sisters or cousins or any kind of relatives, they weren't allowed to talk to them. That is something that has affected them for their entire lives. They felt separated. They felt cut off from family.
The assimilation policy strove to alienate children from their families, communities, and cultures. They generally applied a harsh set of rules. Children were forced to abandon their cultural and spiritual ways. They were forbidden to speak their languages, and in many cases received only marginal training or education. Many children felt lonely, helpless, and hopeless. In 1969, the Government of Canada withdrew from the operation of residential schools. Since then, thousands of former students have come forward to reveal the emotional, physical, and other forms of abuse which were rampant in the school system. Nearly all say little was done to improve conditions.
The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, TRC, has many calls to action. And these calls to action are to make a change, to make a difference. And one of the things is to recognize and acknowledge the past and what has happened with residential schools, with the residential school experience to the individuals. I was motivated to do something more, and that's where I became a children's book author, and one of the books was called You're Just Right. There's lots of things that tie in with what individuals have gone through. Separation from family, missing loved ones, being sad, finding gifts and talents, growing, looking back on your life, trying to live a better life. When the children were taken away from their families and put into the residential schools, they weren't around their homes anymore. They weren't around their moms and dads. All they had was some of the memories. They felt alone, but it was those memories that helped pull them through. And I encourage you, as you're growing up and living life, to make good choices, to make good memories, so that when you look back on your life, you will have those good memories.
Today, Indigenous and non-Indigenous organizations in Canada and from around the world have joined together to initiate healing and restoring Indigenous culture, beginning a movement toward truth and reconciliation.